A child reaches toward a berry patch, the wrong one, the poisonous one, and a hand closes hard around their wrist before the fingers ever touch it. No warning, no explanation yet, just pain, sudden and immediate, stopping a mistake before it could become a body. That single moment, repeated across 10,000 generations, is the real origin of discipline, not cruelty, timing. You've probably absorbed some version of a very old assumption, that ancient parents were harsher than modern ones. That raw survival demanded a kind of discipline we've since softened into something our ancestors wouldn't even recognize. It's a tidy story. It fits what most people already believe about the deep past. Brutal conditions produce brutal parenting, and gentleness is a luxury only recent generations could afford. But the actual ethnographic and archaeological record doesn't cooperate with that story. Not even close. Start with what anthropologist Barry Hewlett documented among the aka forest foragers of the Congo Basin, whose parenting practices he spent years observing directly, up close, day after day. Physical intervention existed. It was fast, immediate, and reserved almost exclusively for one narrow category: mistakes a child could not be permitted to make twice. Reaching toward an open fire, wandering past the tree line alone, handling something venomous without knowing what it was. In each case, correction arrived before explanation, because explanation takes time, and some mistakes don't leave room for a second attempt. The same pattern shows up far outside Central Africa. Among the Hadza of Tanzania and in Inuit communities across the Arctic, researchers have documented a near-identical logic: instantaneous physical correction reserved for a short list of survival-coded dangers, and almost nothing else treated the same way. Different continents, different climates, different subsistence strategies built around completely different threats, and yet the same short list of unforgivable mistakes over and over independently arrived at. That's the part of the story that matches the myth you grew up with. Here's the part that breaks it. Outside those narrow, survival-coded moments, forager childhood was, by most ethnographic accounts, strikingly permissive. Melvin Konner's decades of fieldwork among the Kungsan of the Kalahari described children given wide latitude to explore, to fail, to make ordinary human mistakes without consequence. Tantrums were tolerated, not suppressed. Curiosity was rarely punished, even when it was inconvenient for the adults around it. Hill and Magdalena Hurtado's long-term work among the Ek of Paraguay found something similar. Children granted a degree of autonomy that would look, by modern standards, almost reckless. Set that against the image most people carry of pre-modern childhood: obedience enforced through fear, a small body kept in line by a bigger one. And the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. You'd expect a species raising children in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable to lean toward strictness as a default setting. Instead, strictness was the exception, applied surgically to a small, specific list of threats. Everything else ran on something closer to indulgence. The explanation isn't that ancient parents were inconsistent. It's that they were rarely acting alone. Anthropologist Hrdy has spent much of her career on a concept called alloparenting, the observation that in most documented forager societies, a child wasn't raised by two exhausted adults working in isolation. They were raised by a rotating, overlapping cast. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated adults within the same band, all sharing responsibility for keeping one small, accident-prone human alive long enough to become useful, then capable, then an adult in their own right. When the burden of a child's survival is distributed across a dozen caregivers instead of concentrated in one household, the pressure that tends to produce harsh, fear-based discipline in isolated family units simply has far less room to build. You are not looking at a parenting system built on fear. You're looking at one built on redundancy: enough adult eyes, enough spare hands, that no single caregiver ever had to be the last line of defense against every possible disaster alone. The wrist grab covers toddlers and the handful of dangers too fast for language. Older children were a different problem, and foraging societies solved it differently too. Anthropologist David Lancy, surveying childhood across dozens of small-scale societies, found that once a child was old enough to understand consequence, direct physical correction largely disappeared, replaced by something quieter and, in its own way, sharper: teasing. Public embarrassment, delivered gently but unmistakably in front of the band, being left, briefly, to face the natural result of a bad decision instead of a parent's intervention. A child who ignored advice about a dangerous trail might simply be allowed to stumble on it, under distant supervision, and feel the consequence directly rather than hear it secondhand. You don't threaten a 9-year-old the way you stop a 2-year-old from touching fire. You let the world do some of the teaching, and you stand close enough to catch the worst of it without announcing that you're standing there at all. survival. There's a reason this distinction matters beyond ancient history. Cross-cultural research by psychologist John Whiting, comparing child-rearing practices across dozens of societies, found a pattern that has held up remarkably well under later scrutiny. Harsh, authoritarian discipline correlates far more strongly with settled, hierarchical, resource-stratified societies than with small-scale nomadic ones. The image of strict ancient parenting, sitting in most people's heads, isn't actually ancient at all. It's agricultural. It arrived later alongside property, inheritance, and the sudden, unprecedented problem of raising children who might one day grow up to claim ownership of things that mattered. Foragers had a different problem entirely. Not long-term obedience, survival to sunset, and then survival to the sunset after that, and the one after that. There was no estate to protect a generation later, no hierarchy of names to preserve. Just a small number of bodies that needed to still be breathing by morning, and a community large enough to make sure that responsibility never rested on one exhausted set of shoulders. So the wrist grab in the berry patch was never the beginning of a punishment. It was the entire punishment. Start and finish. 3 seconds long, no lecture attached, no extended consequence trailing behind it. By evening, that same child might be back in that same adult's lap, indulged, unafraid, already forgiven before the memory of the fear had even finished fading. Ancient discipline wasn't a philosophy handed down through generations of deliberate parenting theory. It was a reflex, aimed narrowly at the handful of mistakes that didn't allow for a second chance. And everywhere else. Deliberately, almost tenderly, left alone. Think about what that means for the story you were told growing up, the one where tough love gets framed as ancestral wisdom, as the way things worked before modern parenting got soft. That framing has it almost exactly backwards. What actually shows up in the deep record isn't generalized toughness, it's precision, a species that could not afford to waste fear on the wrong things. Because fear itself has a cost. A child too anxious to explore is a child who never learns to forage, never learns terrain, never becomes competent enough to survive without you. Ancient parents weren't gentle out of sentiment, they were gentle because indulgence in the right doses was the more efficient survival strategy. It's worth sitting with what that actually implies. The harshness modern parents sometimes brace themselves for, the instinct to tighten control out of fear something terrible might happen. That instinct is real and it's old, but the constant generalized strictness so many people assume came bundled with it. That part isn't ancestral wisdom. It's a much younger invention, one that arrived with fences, ledgers, and things worth inheriting. The hand that grabs your wrist and the hand that lets go are the same hand. Ancient childhood ran on both. In that order, thousands of times over, across a species born with almost nothing built in. No claws, no speed, no natural armor, until enough narrowly avoided mistakes finally added up to a childhood survived. Somewhere in that pattern is the actual inheritance worth claiming, not the myth of a harder, harsher past that makes the present look weak by comparison. Something closer to the opposite, a species that figured out, long before it had a word for parenting, exactly where fear was useful and exactly where it wasn't. Sharp where it had to be, soft everywhere else, and distributed widely enough that no single hand ever had to carry the whole weight of keeping a child alive alone.